Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the cook who served her mistress her husband's heart that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. There are places on this earth where history does not simply fade into memory. It decays into legend, festers into folklore, and sometimes it lingers. It clings to the soil, stains the stones, and whispers on the wind. A permanent residue of a tragedy so profound it has altered the very chemistry of the air. If you were to travel deep into the humid, gothic heart of Mississippi, leaving the paved certainty of the highways for the tangled back roads where cypress trees drip with Spanish moss like old men's beards, you might eventually find the remnants of one such place. The locals, in the rare moments they speak of it, know it only as the Whitmore Ruins. It is not a landmark you will find on any tourist map, nor a site commemorated with a historical plaque. It is a place spoken of in hushed tones, a collective nightmare the region has tried and failed to forget, a scar on the landscape that refuses to heal. At first glance, it is nothing more than an elegant skeleton picked clean by time. 4 skeletal columns, once proud and bone-white, now stand grey and leprous, choked with the serpentine embrace of ivy. They rise toward a sky they no longer support, monuments to a fallen kingdom. The grand veranda, where ladies once fanned themselves in the afternoon heat, has collapsed into a treacherous pile of rotting timber, sinking back into the marshy earth. The ground itself has reclaimed what was once a manicured lawn, swallowing it beneath the ride of kudzu and saw palmetto, nature's final victory over human vanity. But it is not the sight of the ruin that will arrest your senses. It is the scent, on a still, hot day, when the air is thick enough to drink and the cicadas drone their hypnotic, maddening song. It will find you. A strange, unsettling perfume that has no place in the wilderness. It is a complex aroma, at once sweet and sharp, deeply unsettling in its incongruity. There is the unmistakable warmth of cloves, a scent of hearth and home. Then, the biting tang of vinegar, sharp and almost sterile. And beneath it all, something deeper, richer, hauntingly familiar, like the ghost of a roast slow-cooked over a fire that was extinguished by tragedy more than a century and a half ago. Paranormal investigators and curious travelers have documented the phenomenon for decades. They speak of how the scent seems to coalesce, growing stronger near the crumbling remains of the kitchen and the smokehouse. It is a mystery that defies scientific explanation, a sensory specter that has puzzled folklorists and frustrated historians. How can a fragrance, born of spice and fire, embed itself so deeply into a place that it outlasts the very walls that once contained it? What event could be so potent, so saturated with the extremes of human emotion, love, rage, grief, and vengeance that it leaves an indelible echo not in sound, but in scent? To understand the ghost of an aroma, one must first travel back in time, back to when these ruins were a stage. Its stones were immaculate, and its air was filled not with legends, but with the suffocating reality of absolute power. Before it was a tomb of memory, the Whitmore Plantation was a kingdom, a self-contained universe built on the twin pillars of cotton and cruelty. In the mid-1800s, it was a name spoken with a mixture of envy and fear. its wealth extracted from the fertile Mississippi soil by the brutal, unceasing labor of over 100 enslaved men, women, and children. The world of the plantation was governed by two inexorable forces: the relentless, punishing sun and the unyielding will of its master. The heat was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket that pressed down from May to September, trapping the air in a miasma of sweat, dust, and the cloying sweetness of magnolia blossoms. It was a heat that bred a languid lethargy in the masters, who spent their days in shaded parlors, but it demanded a frantic, ceaseless energy from the enslaved, who moved like scorched shadows through the endless, in a blindingly white rose of cotton, their backs bent under the twin weights of the sun and the ever-present threat of the lash. The big house stood as a monument to this brutal hypocrisy, a perfect architectural lie. It was a vision of Southern grace, its white facade gleaming, its windows reflecting the vast, indifferent sky like vacant eyes. Manicured gardens, meticulously designed and tended, filled with roses and jasmine, surrounded it, creating a fragrant buffer between the world of the masters and the world of the enslaved. But the elegance was a facade, a thin veneer of civilization painted over a foundation of profound barbarism. Its prosperity was watered with tears and fertilized with blood. The societal structure was as rigid and cruel as the Mississippi heat. At its absolute apex was the master, a man whose authority was biblical in its scope. His word was law, his moods capable of dictating life or death on a whim. He viewed the people he owned not with hatred, for hatred requires the recognition of another's humanity, but with the chilling indifference of a craftsman for his tools. His instrument of enforcement was the overseer, a man chosen not for his wisdom, but for the strength of his arm and the coldness of his heart. He was the ever-present embodiment of violence, his presence a constant, low-level hum of terror in the daily lives of the enslaved, the living symbol that any transgression, no matter how small, would be met with swift and brutal correction. And then there was the mistress, to visitors and neighbors. She was the plantation's crowning jewel, the epitome of Southern womanhood, delicate, poised, her voice as soft as cotton. But beneath the rustle of silk and the shimmer of pearls was a core of glacial ice. Her cruelty was not the hot-blooded rage of her husband, but something far more sinister, a detached, leisurely sadism. She viewed the suffering on her plantation not as a regrettable necessity of her wealth, but as a form of theater, a daily pageant to ward off the boredom of a cloistered life. She would watch the day's punishments from the shade of her veranda, a glass of lemonade resting on a silver tray beside her, condensation tracing lazy paths down the cool glass. Her eyes never flinched when the whip cracked. Her expression was one of mild, detached interest, her head tilted as if observing a peculiar species of insect. Her approval, given with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, was often the signal for the violence to escalate. Her pleasure was the final, terrible ingredient in the plantation's daily recipe of despair. This was the world Eta and Samuel inhabited, a carefully constructed hell designed to strip away identity, crush the spirit, and sever the sacred bonds of family and love. Yet, even in the most barren soil, life finds a way. Within this system of calculated dehumanization, a system designed to reduce men and women to mere property, humanity stubbornly persisted. It lived in the quiet moments, in the stolen glances across the fields, in the shared songs hummed low to the rhythm of the work, spirituals that were both a lament and a promise of a world beyond. It lived, most vibrantly, in the profound love between Etta and her husband, Samuel. Samuel was a man of quiet, unshakable strength, his hands calloused from labor but his spirit unbent. He possessed a warmth that the plantation's cruelty could not extinguish, a light that he shielded carefully for Eta alone. It was in his voice when he sang the old songs in the evenings, his deep baritone weaving through the oppressive air, offering a fleeting moment of grace. It was in the small things, a wildflower left on her cot, a shared piece of fruit, the way his eyes would find hers in a crowd, a silent conversation that spoke of a world beyond the cotton fields, a private universe built for two, for Etta. Samuel was more than a husband. He was her anchor, the one solid point in a world designed to tear her adrift, the living proof that her soul was still her own. And Etta, in turn, was his peace. She was the plantation's cook, a position of strange privilege and profound isolation. It afforded her a small degree of separation from the back-breaking labor of the fields, but it placed her squarely in the belly of the beast, the kitchen of the big house, a silent witness to the master's world. And it was her silence that was her most defining and most unsettling characteristic, in a place where pain was a constant, audible presence expressed in the sharp crack of the whip, in the cries of the punished, in the weary groans of exhaustion. Etta remained still. She moved through the stifling, perpetual heat of the kitchen with a preternatural calm, an economy of motion that was both efficient and unnerving. Her face was a mask of placid neutrality, her eyes revealing nothing. When news of some fresh horror from the fields reached the quarters, others would weep or rage in hushed, fearful tones. Etta would listen, her hands never ceasing their work, her eyes taking on a distant, focused quality. And then she would continue kneading the dough or stirring the pot. The masters, and even some of her fellow slaves, mistook this quietude for submission. For a spirit that had been so thoroughly broken, it had retreated into a state of numb obedience. They were dangerously, fatally wrong. Her silence was not empty. It was full. It was a vessel, a deep, dark well into which she poured every injustice she witnessed, every casual cruelty, every lash that fell on the backs of her people. It was a silence of profound observation, a meticulous accounting of sin. When the mistress would issue a callous order for the evening's meal, dismissing the hunger of the field hands, Etta's eyes would meet hers for a fraction of a second, and in that fleeting moment, there was not fear or subservience, but a cold, clear, and terrifying assessment. Her stillness was not surrender. It was the forging of an armor, piece by painstaking piece. It was the honing of a blade on the whetstone of grief. It was a storm gathering its terrible power far out at sea, silent and unseen, waiting for the press's inevitable moment to break upon the shore. The storm that had gathered for so long in the soul of Etta broke not with the fury of thunder, but with the mundane triviality of a misplaced tool. It was a Tuesday. The sun was at its zenith, a merciless white eye in a bleached sky, and the air was a physical weight. Samuel, his body slick with sweat, his muscles aching from hours of labor, had paused for a fraction of a second to wipe the stinging salt from his brow. In that moment, a hoe, its handle worn smooth by his own hands, slipped from its resting place and clattered against the stone. The sound was small, insignificant against the vast, droning silence of the fields. But it was enough. The overseer, a man whose authority was measured in the fear he could inspire, saw not an accident, but an act of defiance. He saw laziness. He saw disrespect. It was the pretext he had been waiting for. Word traveled with the swift, cruel efficiency of a pestilence, from the fields to the slave quarters, and up to the shaded veranda of the big house. A lesson was to be made. A spectacle was required. Within the hour, the ceaseless rhythm of the plantation came to a halt. The enslaved were herded from their work, their faces grim, their eyes downcast, and forced to form a silent, semicircular audience. They knew the liturgy of this particular ritual all too well. At its center was the whipping post, its wood stained dark with the memories of past agonies, and bound to it was Samuel. His shirt had been stripped from him, his wrists lashed tight, his back stretched taut and vulnerable, a human canvas awaiting the artist's brutal brush. Etta was forced to the front, made to kneel in the dust where she could not look away. The world around her seemed to recede, the sounds of the cicadas and the fearful shuffling of her people fading into a distant roar. There was only the sight of Samuel's back. The man who was her anchor, now exposed and helpless. Her every muscle screamed to move, to shield him, to throw herself between the whip and his skin. But she remained motionless, a statue carved from compressed agony. She knew the calculus of this place. Her defiance would not save him. It would only earn her the same fate, and he would be forced to watch her in return. So she knelt, her nails digging into her palms, drawing blood in perfect, crescent-shaped wounds that mirrored the horror before her. It was the only pain she could control. On the veranda, the mistress had arranged herself as if for a garden party. Her dress was a cloud of white muslin, a parasol tilted delicately against the sun's glare. She murmured something to the neighboring lady seated beside her, and a light. Tinkling laugh floated across the yard, a sound of such profound incongruity that it was more violent than any blow. The overseer raised his arm, the leather whip, thick and oiled, coiled in his hand like a serpent before striking. It sliced through the humid air with a sound like tearing silk and landed with a wet, percussive crack. Samuel's body arched against the ropes, a guttural groan torn from his throat, a sound thick with blood and betrayal. But he did not beg. He would not give them the satisfaction. Again, the whip fell, and again, the overseer. His face flushed with exertion and power, worked with a grim, methodical rhythm. Flesh peeled away in red ribbons, blood sprayed, warm and metallic, spattering the dirt where Etta knelt. She did not scream. She did not cry out. She gave them nothing. Her grief was too immense, too sacred for their eyes. She swallowed it down, choking on its bitterness, and let it turn to something harder, something colder, in the hollow of her chest. The performance continued until Samuel's cries broke into silence, his strength finally faltering, his head slumped forward, his chest heaving in shallow, ragged bursts. His body went slack, held up only by the ropes that bit into his wrists. The mistress lifted her glass of lemonade, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it down with a soft click. "That will do," she said, her voice as calm and untroubled as if she were dismissing a servant who had overwatered her roses. The overseer, breathing heavily, dropped the whip. Two men untied Samuel's limp frame and dragged him to the edge of the field, tossing him into the dust like a broken sack of grain. No doctor was called. No prayers were spoken. His punishment was his death, and his death was nothing more than a passing afternoon's diversion. Only when the others had dispersed, when the stage was empty and the audience dismissed, did Etta rise. Her body trembled with a violence she could no longer contain as she walked to where he lay. His chest rose once, a final, shuddering breath, and then stopped. His eyes stared upward, glassy and unfocused, fixed on a sky that had offered no mercy. She knelt beside him, her hand brushing his cheek, smearing blood across her fingers. In the echoing silence, his breath had left behind. A vow was formed. It was not a thought. It was not a prayer. It was a cold, hard certainty that settled into her bones. A piece of ice forming in the very center of her soul. They would not erase him. She would make them remember. That night, the plantation slept under a swollen, yellow moon. But for Etta, there was no sleep. There was only the vow. when the last light in the big house had been extinguished and the only sounds were the rasping of crickets and the distant howl of a lone dog. She moved. She was a shadow, silent as smoke, her bare feet making no sound on the cool earth as she made her way to the smokehouse. This was where they had thrown him, his body discarded among the curing hams and slabs of bacon, as if he were just another piece of meat. The irony was a fresh, bitter wound. The heavy wooden door creaked. She pushed it open, the sound like a tired throat groaning. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, with the smells of salt, smoked pork, and old, dried blood. In the wavering light of the small lantern she carried, hooks dangled from the rafters, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like hanging men. In the corner, by the great butcher's block, lay Samuel. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she brushed the flies from his wounds, her touch as gentle as it had been in life. She allowed herself one sob, a single, tearing sound that was swallowed by the heavy silence before it could fully escape. She could not afford to break. Not now. Grief was a luxury. Vengeance was a necessity, with a purpose that felt ancient and inexorable. She began her work. It was a ritual, a terrifying and sacred transformation of her role. She was no longer just a cook. She was a priestess, and this was her liturgy. First, she washed him. She fetched a basin, and with a clean cloth, she reverently wiped away the dried blood and the filth of the field, her hands tracing the lines of his face, his shoulders, his chest, memorizing him one last time. She whispered to him, her voice a low hum, her words not for a deaf God, but for him. "They will not forget you," she murmured, her breath misting in the cool air. "They will carry you in their bellies. They will choke on what they've done." When she was finished, she reached for the tools of her trade, which were now to become the instruments of a sacrament. The butcher's knife, long and sharp, its edge honed for cleaving bone. Her hand closed around the handle, steady now, imbued with a terrible resolve. Each slice was a prayer. Each cut was a line in her vow. She worked with the chilling precision of her craft, the knowledge born of years spent carving countless hams and dressing countless birds for the mistress's table. But this was different. This was not butchery. It was a reclamation. She whispered with every stroke, "For your pain, they will suffer. For your blood, they will bleed. For your death, they will die." The work was slow, meticulous, performed in the flickering hellish glow of the lantern when she had prepared the cuts. She turned to her spice box, the small wooden chest that held the secrets to her acclaimed cooking. She rubbed the seasonings deep into the flesh cloves for memory, pepper for pain, vinegar for preservation, salt for the tears she would not shed. She was preparing him not for burial, but for consumption. This was not desecration. This was a dark and terrible resurrection. By the time the moon was high and pale, her work was done. She wrapped the prepared portions carefully in clean cloth, stacking them neatly, before scrubbing the butcher's block until it was pale and raw, erasing all but the deepest stains. She left what remained of Samuel covered and at peace, pressing a final kiss to his cold forehead before extinguishing the lantern and stepping back into the night, her arms laden with the instruments of her retribution. The opportunity for the first act of this retribution came sooner than she could have hoped. 2 days later, the mistress, flush with the success of her lesson, decided that Samuel's death was not merely a punishment to be forgotten, but a principle to be celebrated. She announced a supper party. Her voice, sharp and imperious, echoed down from a dressing room as Eta stood below. "Cook, we'll have guests tonight. They'll expect something fine," the mistress had called out, her eyes meeting Eta's in the reflection of a mirror. "None of your usual chicken or stews. Tonight must be special. Something to be remembered." Etta had simply bowed her head, hiding the cold fire that flickered in her eyes. Special. The word curled in her chest like a serpent. Oh, it would be special. It would be a meal to be remembered for all eternity. That evening, the kitchen of the big house was a symphony of culinary activity. But beneath the familiar sounds and smells was a current of terrible, sacred purpose. The hearth glowed, its flames devouring logs as pots simmered and pans hissed. The scents of garlic, pepper, and herbs filled the air, a fragrant mask for the iron tang that clung stubbornly to Etta's memory. On the butcher's block, she laid out a masterpiece for the evening. It was his heart, heavy, dark, and strong, its intricate network of veins a silent testament to the life it had once sustained. Etta handled it with an almost holy reverence, her fingertips brushing its surface like a relic. This was not just meat. This was the rhythm that had kept him alive through endless toil, the core that had beaten defiantly against the lash until it had finally been broken. Now, it would become the centerpiece of their celebration, the dark sun around which their trivial world would orbit for one final night. She braised it slowly, searing it first before lowering it into a pot of rich broth spiced with cloves, onions, and molasses. The fragrance that rose was intoxicating, rich and sweet, coating the air in something both comforting and deeply sinister. She basted it for hours, her movements precise and unhurried, until the once living organ looked like the finest cut of beef ever to grace a southern table, its surface glistening like dark mahogany. When the guests arrived, their laughter and chatter echoing through the halls, Etta was ready. She carried out the preliminary dishes, her face a mask of placid servitude. Finally, as the mistress tapped her glass for silence and made a toast to discipline and order, Etta entered, silent and steady, her arms cradling the main platter. She placed it in the center of the long candle-lit table. The heart gleamed under the chandelier's crystal glow, resting on a bed of roasted root vegetables, its rich, dark juices pooling around it. The aroma wafted through the room, thick and irresistible. A collective murmur of approval rippled through the guests. The mistress leaned forward, her eyes bright with a greedy, almost feverish hunger. "My word, cook," she breathed, fanning herself. "You have truly outdone yourself." With an eager grace, she took the carving knife and sliced into it. The blade met no resistance. It was perfectly tender. Steam rose as the first piece fell onto a plate. She speared it with a fork, lifted it delicately to her painted lips, and took the first bite. The room held its breath. The mistress's eyes fluttered shut. A soft, unrestrained moan of pure, sensual pleasure escaped her lips. "Exquisite," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I have never tasted anything like it." That was the signal. Laughter and conversation erupted as the platter was passed around. The clinking of silverware filled the air, punctuated by hums of approval and lavish praise for the cook. From her corner, Etta watched, her expression unchanging. She watched as they devoured her grief. She watched as they praised her vengeance. She watched as the mistress, with glistening lips and shining eyes, ate her own sin, bite by ecstatic bite. The feast marked the beginning of a profound and terrible transformation. The ecstasy of that single meal did not fade with digestion. It planted a seed in the mistress's soul, a black and insatiable craving that began to grow roots. The following morning, she awoke not with the pleasant memory of a fine dinner, but with an urgent, gnawing hunger. It was a physical ache, a hollowness that the usual breakfast of eggs and cured ham could not touch. The food of her everyday life had turned to ash in her mouth. Every flavor was a pale imitation, a disappointing ghost of the richness she now craved. By noon, the desire had become a low, insistent fever. She summoned Etta, her voice sharp with an unfamiliar edge of desperation. "That dish," she demanded. Forgoing any preamble, "the one from last night. Make it again." Etta stood with her hands folded, her expression as smooth and unreadable as polished river stone. "I'm sorry, Mistress," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "That was a rare cut. It cannot be repeated." The mistress's painted brows furrowed in disbelief and indignation. "Nonsense. Everything can be repeated. Find more. I don't care what it costs." But Etta only bowed her head. Her lips a thin, tight line. "It is gone, Mistress," she repeated. And in her finality, there was no defiance, only the simple, unassailable power of a fundamental truth. The denial festered. It was a splinter under the mistress's skin, a constant irritant that grew more inflamed with each passing hour. The taste haunted her. It ambushed her in moments of quiet, in the scent of a rose, in the metallic tang of a pinprick of blood on her finger as she sewed. Her mouth would water, and a shiver would trace its way down her spine. Though the sun was high and hot, days bled into a week, and the hunger deepened from a simple craving into a maddening obsession. Her celebrated palate, once capable of discerning the subtlest of flavors, was now ruined for all other food. Pork seemed stringy and tasteless, chicken dry as dust, and even the richest wines felt flat and sour on her tongue. Her temper frayed. She snapped at the maids, her voice a shrill lash for the slightest infraction. She took to pacing the long hallways of the big house, her silk gowns rustling, her movements like those of a caged animal. Her husband, the master, began to notice the change. He saw the new, feverish gleam in her eyes, the shadows that had taken root beneath them, the way she pushed her supper plate away with a look of undisguised disgust. He chided her for her moods, attributing them to feminine vapors or a passing illness, utterly oblivious to the true nature of the sickness that was consuming her from within. Her nights became a landscape of torment. She dreamed. In these dreams, she sat at the head of an impossibly long dining table, lit not by candles, but by an infernal, crimson glow. Before her lay the dish, steaming and fragrant, a perfect, glistening heart. She would carve into it, the juices running red, and with each bite, her body would shudder in an agony of ecstasy. She would look up, her fingers slick with grease, and see Etta standing in the shadows at the far end of the room, her eyes glowing faintly, a silent observer to her damnation. She would awaken with a gasp, her nightdress damp with sweat, her tongue running along her teeth as if searching for scraps of the phantom feast. This nocturnal theater only sharpened her daytime desperation. The hunger was no longer a desire. It was a tyrant, and she was its most willing subject. The irrefutable evidence of Etta's vengeance was not something that could be presented in a court of law. It was being written, cell by cell, into the very body and soul of her tormentor. The mistress herself had become the living, breathing proof of the crime. As Samuel's meticulously prepared remains dwindled, stored away in the cool darkness, Etta began a new phase of her campaign. She saw the mistress's unraveling, the way her hands trembled, the way her eyes followed Etta's every move in the kitchen. The time for denial was over. The time for conditioning had begun. One evening, she brought the mistress a small covered dish. It was a rich stew, the broth dark and savory. The mistress inhaled its aroma like a drowning woman breathing air, and she devoured it greedily, her lips stained, her breath coming in fast, shallow gulps between spoonfuls. It was not the same cut, not the heart, but it was close enough. It carried the same ghost of flavor, the same impossible richness. It was a partial satiation that only deepened the underlying addiction. Night after night, the ritual was repeated. A pie with a savory filling that made the woman weep with gratitude. a small roast so tender she licked the bones clean. Each meal was a carefully measured dose of the poison she craved, and with each dose, the power dynamic in the house shifted irrevocably. The mistress no longer commanded, she begged. Her voice, once dripping with aristocratic command, would break as she pleaded. "Cook, please, just a taste." She offered payment, jewels, freedom, anything. But Etta would only shake her head. Her refusal, calm and absolute until the mistress was reduced to a sobbing wreck. And then, and only then, would a small portion be granted. Etta was no longer her slave. She had become her god, the sole arbiter of her pleasure and pain. The master, witnessing this bizarre, obsessive devotion, grew first suspicious, then enraged. He accused Etta of witchcraft, of poisoning his wife's mind. One night, he confronted her in the kitchen, his face contorted with fury, his hand raised to strike her. But before he could, the mistress flew at him, a wraith of silk and desperation, her nails raking his face. "Touch her!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, unrecognizable sound. "And I will see you rot in your own fields." The master stood stunned, silenced not by the threat, but by the terrifying, all-consuming need in his wife's eyes. He retreated, becoming a ghost in his own house, an irrelevance. He had lost his wife, not to another man, but to a flavor, to a hunger that was now all she was. The final portions of Samuel were dwindling. Etta knew the ritual was approaching its terrible, preordained conclusion. The master was no longer just an obstacle. He was the final ingredient. He was the source of the original sin, the hand that had guided the whip. It was only fitting that he become the final sacrament. One moonless night, the master, drunk on whiskey and humiliation, cornered Etta in the one place where their story had truly begun, the smokehouse. "You think I don't know?" he spat, his voice thick with liquor and rage. "You've bewitched her. I'll put an end to this. I'll put an end to you." He lunged, his heavy hand reaching for her. But the woman he reached for was not the submissive cook he thought he knew. She moved with a speed and strength born of pure distilled purpose. She sidestepped his clumsy attack, and in the same fluid motion, the butcher's knife, which she now carried with her always, flashed in the lantern light. The blade sank deep into his side. He gasped, a look of profound, stupid surprise on his face as he stared down at the dark, blossoming stain on his shirt. She did not hesitate. The knife rose and fell again, quick and merciless, a punctuation to a silent vow. There was no pleasure in the act, no rage. There was only a cold, grim finality, the balancing of a scale that had been tipped for far too long. He collapsed onto the great wooden block, the very altar where her vengeance had been conceived, his blood now mingling with the dark stains of Samuel's memory. She stood over him for a moment, her breath steady, and whispered into the sudden silence, "Now you will feed her." And then, with the same chilling reverence, with the same sacred precision, she began her work once more. The next day, the air in the big house was thick with the most intoxicating aroma it had ever known. It drew the mistress from her chambers, her body trembling with an almost unbearable anticipation. In the dining room, a great roast sat glistening on a silver platter, its skin crisp to perfection, its surface lacquered with molasses until it gleamed like dark, polished mahogany. It was the feast she had been dreaming of, the culmination of all her desire. She seized the carving knife, her hands shaking, and sliced into the tender meat. As the first bite touched her tongue, her entire body convulsed. Tears of pure ecstasy streamed down her hollowed cheeks. "Perfect," she gasped, her voice choked with sobs of pleasure. "Oh, cook, my angel, my salvation. Perfect." She ate with a feral intensity, slice after slice, her fingers slick with grease, weeping openly, lost in a paroxysm of delight. When she was finally sated, her body sagging in her chair, exhausted and glowing with sweat, she looked up at Eta, her eyes full of a worshipful, slavish devotion. "Another," she whispered. "Just one more piece." Eta stepped forward, her face as impassive as ever. She took the plate and returned a moment later. But instead of another slice of meat, there was something small resting in the center of the fine china. The mistress blinked, her drug-addled mind struggling to comprehend. It was a ring, a man's gold wedding band, scuffed from years of wear. Her hand trembled as she picked it up, turning it over in her fingers. She recognized it instantly. The engraved initials inside, her husband's ring. The blood drained from her face. Her wild, disbelieving eyes darted from the ring in her hand to the remains of the magnificent roast on the platter. And finally, to the calm, silent figure of a cook standing in the corner. There was no denial in Eta's eyes, no explanation, only a quiet, unwavering finality. And in that silence, the full crushing weight of the truth descended. The roast she had praised, the meat she had wept over, the dish she had called salvation. Her husband, a strangled, animal sound was torn from her throat. She clutched the ring to her chest as a wave of violent nausea racked her body. She retched, gagging on the richness still coating her tongue. But even as her body tried to expel the horror, the monster she had become betrayed her. Her stomach groaned with hunger. Her mouth watered. Her tongue still quivered with an insatiable, hellish longing. The truth had finally been served. 3 days passed. A profound and unnatural silence fell over the Whitmore plantation. The shutters on the big house hung open, clattering faintly in the breeze. No smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. No orders were shouted from the veranda. It was this eerie stillness that finally drew the neighbors. Worried by the uncharacteristic quiet, a small party of landowners rode up the long oak-lined drive. Their knocks at the great front door were met only by echoes. Pushing it open, the hinges groaned like something in pain. They found her in the dining room. The scene that greeted them would become the bedrock of the region's darkest legend. The mistress sat at the head of the table, her fine silk gown wrinkled and stained, her pearls askew. Her face was locked in a horrifying, permanent expression, a mask of rictus that was half ecstatic smile, half agonized grimace. Her eyes were rolled back in her head, her lips parted as if to take another bite. Before her, the silver platter lay empty, the bones stripped clean, the grease congealed into dark, ugly stains. She was dead. But as one woman later swore in a trembling voice, it was as if she had died in the very act of worship. The master's chair was empty. A search of the house, and then the grounds, revealed nothing. His boots were gone from the foyer, his hat missing from its hook. He had vanished as completely as if the earth had simply swallowed him whole. The official explanation, the one recorded in the sparse county ledgers, was a tragic, if scandalous one. The master, ashamed and disgusted by his wife's sudden and violent descent into madness, had abandoned the plantation, leaving her to die alone at a table. But this was the story for the official record, the neat, tidy explanation that allowed society to smooth over the jagged edges of the unthinkable. The enslaved community knew a different truth. They needed no investigation. They saw the scrubbed clean butcher's block in the smokehouse, the unnaturally dark patch of soil behind it. And they looked into Eta's calm, quiet eyes, and they understood. In the nights that followed, as the fate of the Whitmore plantation hung in legal limbo, The story was told in whispers, huddled around low fires in the secrecy of the slave quarters. It was not a story of a crime, but of a reckoning. They spoke of how the cook, a woman they had mistaken for being broken, had risen up in her silence. They spoke of how she had taken vengeance not with fire or a lash, but with a pot and a knife. She had listened to the mistress's praises, watched her lick her fingers, and known that she was making her enemy praise the very man she had murdered. Etta had not simply killed her oppressors, she had made them accomplices in their own damnation, forcing them to consume their own cruelty, bite by bite, until it had consumed them in return. There were no trials, no legal repercussions in the modern sense. There could be none, for the justice that had been meted out was of an older, more elemental kind. The only court was the kitchen, the only judge was the cook, and the sentence had been served, hot and exquisitely seasoned. In the immediate aftermath of the discoveries at the Whitmore plantation, a curtain of silence and confusion descended upon the county. The official narrative, hastily constructed and eagerly accepted, was one of tragedy born from madness and abandonment. But this was a story that satisfied the ledgers, not the soul. It did not explain the look on the mistress's face, a grotesque portrait of ecstasy and horror that would haunt the nightmares of the men who found her. It did not explain the utter disappearance of the master, and it certainly did not explain the strange, almost triumphant calm that seemed to settle over the plantation's enslaved population. In the chaos of the ensuing months, with the legal ownership of the property entangled in distant courts, the great engine of the plantation simply wound down. The overseer, his authority vanished with his employers, quietly left the county. One by one, the enslaved families were sold off or transferred to other properties, the human assets of a collapsed kingdom being liquidated, and with their dispersal. The true story, the one whispered in the quarters, began its long journey into legend. The plantation itself began to die. A place so thoroughly saturated with cruelty could not survive without its masters. For a time, distant relatives tried to manage it, but the land seemed to refuse to yield. Crops failed. Livestock sickened. No one wanted to buy the property. A dark stain had been left upon it, a reputation that no amount of money or time could scrub away. The big house, once a symbol of unassailable power, was the first to truly fall. Its windows, like vacant eyes, were shattered by storms or vandals. The fine furniture was either carted away by creditors or left to be consumed by mildew and termites. The wind, once shut out by heavy drapes and glass, now roamed the hallways freely, moaning through the empty rooms like a restless spirit. The manicured gardens surrendered to the relentless advance of the wilderness. The delicate roses choked out by thorns and weeds, a perfect metaphor for the truth that had finally consumed the lie. The name Whitmore, once a synonym for wealth and influence, was redefined. It became a local curse, a name parents used to frighten children into obedience. The plantation was no longer a place of commerce. It had been reborn as a place of fear, a monument not to the ambition of its builders, but to the terrifying totality of its fall. Decades passed. The Civil War came and went, tearing the old world apart. But the ruin of the Whitmore place remained, a stubborn ghost of a bygone era. It became a landmark for all the wrong reasons, a place that teenagers would dare each other to approach on moonless nights, a place that travelers on the nearby roads would hurry past. An unconscious hand, perhaps making a sign against evil. Those who were foolish enough to seek shelter within its crumbling walls spoke of strange experiences. They described the unnerving feeling of being watched, the sound of a woman weeping and laughing at the same time, And, most insistently, that strange, inexplicable scent of spice and roasting meat that would sometimes rise from the cold, dead stones of the kitchen. The collapse was not merely physical, it was metaphysical. The property had been so thoroughly desecrated by the events that it had become a wound on the landscape, a place outside of the normal flow of time, forever trapped in the echo of its own violent history. The house did not just fall down, it was pulled down, dragged back into the earth by the sheer weight of the sins that had been committed within it, and the even greater weight of the justice that had followed. A place does not become haunted on its own. It requires a ghost. And as the years turned to decades, the legend of what had happened at the Whitmore place began to crystallize around the one figure whose fate remained a mystery eta. In the official records, she simply ceased to exist. In the chaotic aftermath and the subsequent emancipation, a single literate cook could have vanished without a trace, taking a new name, moving to a new city, and living out her days in quiet, anonymous freedom. Some versions of the story, the more hopeful ones, insist this is what happened, that she escaped the South and found a measure of peace, her terrible work complete. But this is not the version of the story that survived. This is not the version that took root in the collective consciousness. The legend, the one that is still told, insists that Etta never left. This version of the story posits that her act of vengeance was so total, so all-consuming, that it fused her spirit to the place itself. She did not simply get justice, she became justice. In the folklore of the region, she was transformed into the eternal warden of the ruins, a spectral guardian of its dark history. They called her the Cook of Whitmore, a name spoken with a mixture of terror and awe. It was said that her knife never dulled and her fire never went out. Parents warned their greedy children not to steal from the table, whispering that the cook would come and feed them their own selfish hands for supper. Lovers were warned against betrayal, for it was said she would carve out the unfaithful heart and serve it to the one who had been wronged. She became a dark angel of retribution, a figure of mythic power born from the absolute powerlessness of a slave. The story spread, carried by word of mouth along the Mississippi River by traveling laborers and freedmen. It mutated and grew with each telling, absorbing local superstitions and fears. Yet its core components remained terrifyingly intact: the cruel mistress, the murdered husband, and the feast of damnation. The lingering secrets of the event only fed the legend's fire. What truly became of the master's body? The story insisted, with chilling certainty, that nothing was left to be found, for his wife's hunger had been absolute. He had been erased, his physical form entirely consumed by the consequences of his own cruelty. And what of Etta's mind? Had she retained a sanity to the terrible ordeal of her ritual, or had she too been consumed, not by hunger, but by the sheer, unblinking totality of her own vengeance? The legend offers no easy answers. It presents her simply as an instrument, a force of nature as undeniable as a flood or a fire, leaving us to ponder the human cost of her terrible victory. Her legacy is one of profound and terrifying ambiguity, a ghost story that feels more like a historical document. And so, we are left at the end, standing in the ruins of a fallen house, with the faint, impossible scent of cloves and vinegar in the air. We are left with a story that poses a deeply unsettling question about the nature of justice, when all avenues of righteous recourse are closed, when the law itself is an instrument of your oppression. What is the moral calculus of revenge? Etta's actions were monstrous, a violation of the most sacred human taboos. Yet, they were also a horrifyingly perfect reflection of the monstrosity she endured. She took the symbolism of the society that oppressed her, a society that consumed black bodies for its own sustenance, and she made it literal. Was her act and descent into madness? Or was it a moment of terrible divine clarity? The story of the Cook of Whitmore serves as a brutal warning, a philosophical epilogue written in blood and bone. It suggests that cruelty is a closed system, a serpent that will inevitably devour its own tail. It whispers that the act of dehumanizing another is the first step in unraveling one's own humanity. The mistress, in her arrogance, believed she was consuming a simple meal. In truth, she was swallowing her own damnation, served to her on a silver platter. The tale endures not because of its shock value, but because it speaks to a primal, terrifying truth about the world, that sin has a taste, that cruelty has a scent, and that vengeance, sometimes, is a dish best served hot. It forces us to look into the darkest corners of our history and ask ourselves, what ghosts have we created, and what are they still trying to feed us?